And to pick up a couple of themes that Diana and Brian have already raised. I'd like you to imagine, if you will, that your job, this is a view from the other side in a way, your job is to make sure that the UK can fight wars in faraway places. That's your responsibility. Now, in order to do that, you need to have materiel, you need to have tanks and bombs and things in order to be able to fight the war. You also need to have the public on board in a society like ours, and you need to have people willing to join the armed forces as well. And historically, for you, this has been going reasonably well. It's never been easy to get people to join the armed forces or to get the public to go along with your war, but you've done all right, generally speaking. It helps that you can recruit people from age 16, and it helps that usually when you do go to war, the media will sort of swing behind you with headlines saying, support our boys abroad and this kind of thing. Few persistent critics around, usually kept at bay, but sometimes they get their way. There's a small concession you have to make. The first time this happens, it's in Geneva, and the NGOs in Geneva persuade the government to stop sending 16 and 17-year-olds to war. You can still recruit them, but you can't actually send them to war. So this is a setback because you're now recruiting 16 and 17-year-olds, but you can't use them very much. The next thing that happens is the government wants to fight a war that looks like it's going to be pretty unpopular in a faraway place called Iraq, something to do with America. And this is good in a way because it means the armed forces are being put to use, and that's very important for the perpetuation of militarism, that the armed forces are used every now and then. But the public are not very interested in this war. They're either actively hostile or they're indifferent. And now our boys are becoming our boys and girls in Iraq, and headlines are saying our boys support our boys and girls in Iraq, and this is sounding uncomfortably like we're sending our own children out to fight a war. Uncomfortably near the truth, indeed. The embedded journalists are there and they're doing their bit. They're reporting as they should on victories here and there. They're interviewing soldiers who are saying they've got a job to do and they're going to go and do it, and they sound very resolute, although they don't necessarily explain what that job is. But images are filtering through. There's a US tank that's on fire. There's an Iraqi girl whose hands are bleeding and she's bereaved of both her parents. There's a picture of a hollowed out city called Fallujah, which no one's ever heard of before, but in that is now just a ruin. And filtering through the filters, some of the recruits that you've recruited so successfully before are complaining about their kit not being good enough, their flak jackets not being plentiful enough, their armoured vehicles not being resilient enough to roadside bombs. Then the mental health stories start coming through. There's soldiers who have post-traumatic stress disorders. Diana says killing people is the most stressful thing a soldier ever does if it's at close quarters in warfare. It's more stressful than being fired at from a distance. In terms of statistically, it's a more stressful thing to do. If you can actually see the whites of someone's eyes when you kill them, it's extremely stressful. And few actually come away from that unscathed. So these stories start coming through: post-traumatic stress, soldiers having marriage breakdowns, possibly domestic violence, violent offending going up after return from warfare. And these stories are going into the media. A soldier's lost a leg, maybe both legs. And it's getting much more difficult now back home to sustain the recruitment levels that you need to continue fighting this war in Iraq. At the same time, the public are becoming more and more hostile to what's going on. And in military strategic terms, this is almost ironic because the casualty figures, although the casualties themselves are those absolutely serious in their own right, in military strategic terms, the war is won without too much of a loss and on that level, in its own terms, of militarism's own terms. The Iraqis' losses have been far greater, and they're not getting much coverage at all. And of course, the Iraqi civilians have been, their losses have been greater still, and they're having all the same problems. But it's this focus on the news feed coming back from Iraq is really taking its toll on recruitment levels and on public support for the war. 20,000 people are leaving the armed forces every year. That's normal, that's always happened, but it's getting harder to replace them. You raise the marketing budget, keeps going up and up, but the veneer of glamorous military life is being criticised by NGOs in the media, and teenagers themselves can see that the kayaking holiday that the brochure promises you is not the same as the weekly or even daily reports of another 19-year-old soldier killed in Iraq when his warrior armoured vehicle went over a roadside bomb. And now it's happening in Afghanistan. So the Afghanistan war happened sooner, but the British deployment there, in terms of large numbers, only really took off in the mid-2000s. Afghanistan, something to do with Iraq, something to do with America, something to do with girls going to school. It's very difficult to actually see why we are there. I mean, that is, if you ask the general public, those are the kinds of answers you get in terms of there isn't a clear understanding of why we went there, even clear memory of why we went there in the first place. And that war's not going well either. And back home, 16 and 17-year-olds, they're doing they're resitting their GCSEs, they're doing civilian apprenticeships, they're not really joining the army. And recruitment of the 16 and 17-year-old group continues to fall. It was in the thousands, and now it's in the hundreds. You have to relax the body mass index rules in order to let more people in, and recruitment still falls. The ones who are joining are dropping out. About a quarter or a third of them are actually dropping out of their training. And by now the cost of the war is in billions, and the public, who you need to remain on board, are starting to be more vocal, questioning why we're there and why so much money is being wasted. Some soldiers are starting to wonder that too. They're coming out of the armed forces, they're writing books, they're appearing on the One Show, they're questioning why we're there, they're joining the Stop the War Coalition, they're setting up Veterans for Peace. And then an economic crisis happens, which historically is a very good time to recruit young people into the armed forces. But for some reason, despite the very high unemployment rate, the recruitment figures continue to fall, as indeed they have. The public are increasingly, if not hostile to the war, bored of it. The media are the same, pretty bored of it as well. Weary is probably a better word, just weary of the constant similar news stories over and over again. And those pesky critics that you manage to keep at bay most of the time, they win another concession, which is the legal right of under 18s to leave the armed forces, which was introduced in 2011, which just opens the door for the ones you're recruiting to leave again. And they didn't have that legal right before, but now they do, and it's obviously a very difficult thing to argue against. So yeah, I mean, more and more people are kicking up a fuss about what you're doing, about what you're trying to do. What if that was your job, to make sure that war in a faraway place in the future was still a possibility? And what if all of that had been happening and you weren't getting the recruits into the armed forces and you weren't getting the public on board? What would you do? The 2-minute warnings here. What would the pattern develops? What would you do to make sure that in 5 years' time, if necessary, in quotes, you need to go to war in another far-off place? What would you do? Because you're getting pretty desperate. Expect strenuous efforts in the next few years by the state to recruit more people into the armed forces, not just the youngest group into the regulars, but reservists as well, of course, because of the current restructuring plans. Expect strenuous efforts to embed the militarisms that Brian was mentioning into mainstream social culture through such things as Armed Forces Day, although that seems to have been a bit of a failure. And cadet forces in schools, that kind of thing. Expect that to happen. Expect a rush to buy more drones. Expect a rush to privatise privatise your wars so that you can recruit people on a private contract, and you don't have the state's duty of care to that group of people anymore, so you can put them in higher risk situations. But what about the regular forces that you need to staff, and what about the public you need to keep on board? So ForcesWatch was set up partly to scrutinise those developments we see in public culture and through the military's recruitment policy, But we wanted to make sure, we realised that so many other people are interested in these issues and are concerned about them and want to be involved in a movement to challenge them where it seems necessary to do so on human rights grounds as much as anything else. And we hope that through today we can find ways of working together practically, that we can learn a lot from each other, as I'm sure we will, that we can bring these issues to a wider group of people. We can break the issues down into manageable single issues, really, so that we can actually communicate them clearly to a general public. And I hope that we'll see how the day goes, but I hope that will be one of the outcomes for today. Thank you.